They went from stories for boys to songs of innocence, experience, and ultimately surrender. Along the way, they went through one of the greatest sonic evolutions in the history of rock and recorded multiple albums widely considered among the best of all time. Today, we're counting down their best albums. The top 5 albums of U2 is coming up next on Track by Track. Hey everybody, my name's Kyle and this is Track by Track, music reviews, news, and commentary. Thanks for tuning in today, and if this is your first time here, please take a second to click subscribe so you won't miss future reviews and more. U2 is a band that I wish I could say I was a fan of from the very beginning. Unfortunately, I was only 9 years old when their first album came out, and their style of music was pretty far from what would have appealed to me at the time. With only pop radio to influence my tastes during my early teen years, it's likely 1984's Pride in the Name of Love from their 4th album was the first U2 song I ever heard. But it was really a few years later that I, like so many millions of others, truly became fans when the Joshua Tree came out in 1987. Since then, I've picked up every new album on its release day, and of course, gone back to develop an appreciation for the early stuff I'd missed as well. Now, with the band themselves doing a sort of reevaluation of their music with Songs of Surrender, I thought it was a good time to do a reevaluation of my own. So today I present to you my top 5 albums by U2. In 1988, U2 found themselves in the seemingly impossible position of having to come up with a way to follow up their massively successful album, The Joshua Tree. While they were going through a sort of creative identity crisis, they somehow managed to cobble together a double album worth of material that would tide fans over until they found their muse for the next album. Rattle and Hum may not have been intended to be much more than a gap filler between the Joshua Tree and what would eventually be Achtung Baby. But now, after more than 30 years of retrospect, it's clear the album was truly much more than the sum of its parts. And there were so many parts. I mean, what is this thing? We've got live tracks, studio tracks, cover songs, reinterpreted songs, guest features, and even some samples thrown in for good measure. There's a lot of stuff here that foreshadowed the different directions this band would go in the future. God Part 2 could easily have fit on Zooropa, and the gospel reinvention of I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For could have been a preview of Songs of Surrender. At the time of its release, Rattle and Hum seemed a bit like a band and the record company cashing in on a moment. But decades later, it seems to hold up as a listening experience better than ever. It's a beautiful day. By the year 2000, U2 were once again in need of a moment of reinvention. 1997's Pop felt like an appropriate closing chapter to their 90s album trilogy, a series that didn't end quite as strong as it began. Reuniting with Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois as producers, the band hit the reset button in the studio and made a return to the more guitar and melody-driven sound that seemed to sometimes have gotten lost on their more recent electronic-influenced output. The band and the rest of the world were on the verge of a new century, and the time was right for something that brought back the humanity of their sound without backsliding into the well-covered territory of their earlier albums. With opening track Beautiful Day, fans were introduced to U2 version 3.0. Here was a song cycle that felt optimistic and rejuvenated, with the potential to soundtrack a new era. But less than a year later, the events of September 11th changed the world, and the music that once felt perfect for its moment in time seemed slightly out of alignment with our new reality. The following year, U2 opened their iconic Super Bowl halftime performance with Beautiful Day, effectively pivoting the song's positive vibe to the theme of the evening, a tribute to the victims and the heroes of the tragedy. Today, no one thinks of All That You Can't Leave Behind as a 9/11 album, nor should they. In its time, I don't think the album was able to establish itself as firmly within the U2 discography as it deserved. Thankfully, looking back now, it still holds up extremely well. In January of 1983, U2 became a band that mattered. They'd had some success in Ireland with their first 2 albums, but had yet to gain much attention elsewhere. But it was Sunday Bloody Sunday from their third album, War, that changed everything. It was the opening shot in the band's first overtly political work that would turn everything they'd released prior into prologue. U2 truly begins with War. It's hard to imagine that the singles like New Year's Day or Two Hearts Beat as One, not to mention album tracks like Seconds or 40, were actually only modestly popular at the time, when today they're regarded as classics within the band's discography. Every time I revisit the album, I'm always taken aback by how well it holds up, how close to timeless it actually feels. I'd never say that about the albums that preceded it, nor the studio album that followed. And I don't want to suggest that any of that music is in any way disposable. Certainly, The Unforgettable Fire proved to be another huge step forward for the band 2 years later. And in retrospect, both their debut album Boy and their sophomore release October are critical documents of U2's evolution. But none of it matters without War. By the time U2 finally set out to make their true follow-up album to their global smash, The Joshua Tree, they had clearly reached a musical inflection point. Sonically, they had achieved nearly all they could, remaining along the path they'd been following. And if anything, the detours on Rattle and Hum proved there were fruitful new directions worth exploring. The shift on Achtung Baby was, in a word, seismic. The album, of course, ended up being embraced by the masses, but not without a measure of convincing. The first single was The Fly, a bold choice that took a big risk of alienating listeners from the get-go. There were, of course, riches to be found within the rest of the track list, but that first taste was as much a teaser as a warning. I remember longtime fans of the band feeling betrayed by the new sound. And honestly, I think that's fair. But if anything, Achtung Baby more than justifies that evolution as being both necessary and inevitable. Paired with the larger-than-life personas the band adopted for the promotion of the album and the live shows, U2 made it clear there was no going back. It was a bold new adventure, and perhaps the most dramatically successful musical metamorphosis in the history of rock and roll. Many would call it U2's best album. Obviously, to me, it comes close, and more often than not, I'd call it my favorite. But I do think, above all, it is their most important. In the pantheon of modern literary masterpieces, a strong case could be made for The Joshua Tree being considered as a classic example of the great American novel. More than any other album in U2's discography, let alone any act's discography, this is a true album that from start to finish has the feel of epic storytelling and descriptive world building that is usually reserved for the pages of the masterworks by the greatest of authors. Shifting metaphors, The Joshua Tree is a widescreen cinematic experience, a vision of America through the eyes of a foreign auteur, and not unlike the work of Sergio Leone, even created from half a world away. With The Joshua Tree, U2 delivered the most cohesive and effective album of their career, not to mention the most timeless. Partnered with Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, the band created a song cycle for the ages. Where the Streets Have No Name stands among the greatest album openers of all time. Following into I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, With or Without You, Bullet the Blue Sky, and Running to Stand Still, we have one of the most perfect album sides ever recorded. This was the culmination of and conclusion of everything that came before. And the album's enduring power is only strengthened by the fact that from that point on, they never tried to repeat it. The Joshua Tree remains a singular achievement not just for U2, but for all of rock and roll. So there you have it, the top 5 albums by U2. Over the course of more than 4 decades, this is a band whose sound has evolved more than any other act I can think of. And along the way, they produced at least 2 of the greatest albums of all time, both sounding more drastically different from each other than anyone might have imagined they could at the time they were released. But now it's your turn. What would be your top 5 albums by this legendary band? How do you feel about their early albums? Would you include any of their post-2K albums on your list? And how would their latest collection of re-recordings rank for you? Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Once again, my name's Kyle, and this has been Track by Track. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Plus, check out some of these other videos below that I think you might also enjoy. And of course, be sure to subscribe, because true music fans always want new releases the day they come out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.